So what I want to do really for just the next 10 or so minutes is talk to you a little bit as a psychologist about what do the techniques that the United States and others, but tonight our focus is the United States, what do the techniques that we've enacted do to people psychologically? So I'll back up a second and tell you who I am. I'm a psychologist. I'm at Bellevue Hospital in the city. We're at a combined program between Bellevue Hospital and New York University School of Medicine. At our clinic at Bellevue, we care for individuals who come from all over the world, from war zones and other situations in which they may have experienced either war or refugee trauma or torture. We've been doing it for a long time, since probably 1995, I guess now. We've seen several thousand patients from all over the world. But really, sadly and unexpectedly to all of us, after about 2002, we began to get calls about people who had been harmed and abused by the U.S. government and its allies. And that, for us in this business, was a big shock, because one of the things that meant a lot to us, I think, and probably was a foolish way that we felt somehow superior, was that we were providing care and we were the caregivers to people who were coming to seek shelter in the U.S. And after 2002, it became clear that that narrative didn't hold anymore. We were now being asked to consult on folks who had been harmed by our government. So that was an excruciatingly painful process for us to begin to do that work. I have been at Bellevue since 1998, and then for the last 5 years have been consulting with attorneys who go to Guantanamo. Mostly attorneys calling and saying, can you help me figure out how to talk to my client? Can you help me understand what he's been through? And then starting in 2008, I began to go to Guantanamo and evaluate individuals who were held there. So I've evaluated several people who were detainees or are detainees at Guantanamo Bay. So what I was asked to talk about tonight is really is this idea of the psychological torture and the effects of that. And I really want to kind of collapse it into a few simple ideas, since we're not in a class, we've got a lot of material we want to cover. I just want to think about a couple points with you that maybe you'll take with you to understand what is it that we've done and what is it that makes you all come out on a cold winter night and care about this stuff, because you're right to care about it. So what I'm going to talk about tonight is the idea of the psychological effects of torture. And I want to talk to you about two frames. What does it do to us internally when we are tortured psychologically? What happens to us psychologically, emotionally? And what does it do to us interpersonally, between people, okay? Because to me, in the years that I've been doing this, and particularly the last 2 years where I've really focused on Guantanamo and the war on terror, I've seen consequences that are quite severe in those two arenas, the interpsychic and the interpersonal. So when I talk to you a little bit about the internal experience of torture and maltreatment, there's really two concepts I want you to think about that will help you understand what it's like to have been tortured. And the two concepts are the concept of terror and the concept of helplessness. And I share that with you because again and again, when I've talked to people who have been harmed by the people who are detaining them, whether U.S. or not, but tonight the focus is U.S., those two themes recur in what they tell you about their internal state in the process of having been detained and harmed. The first is terror. So let me just briefly talk to you about terror. Terror is a word that probably all of us could go around and define, but what I mean when I talk about terror is a physiological reaction and a physiological state that the human body enters into when it feels that it is in fear when the human feels in fear for his or her life, okay? And terror has an absolutely physiological set of markers. It's not simply, I'm afraid, I feel the cognitions that tell me to be afraid. Terror is something that happens in our bodies, and people who've been traumatized and tortured will tell you this. It has physiological markers in our blood pressure, in our heart rate, in our respiratory functioning, in our levels of hormonal secretion, something called cortisol, in all the physiological things that tell us it's time to fight or flee, fight or flight response. So when you think about a person who's been terrorized and tortured, you have to understand what it means to be terrified. And if you start to imagine what it's like to be terrified, and then imagine being terrified maybe over a very long period of time, you'll start to understand the inner state of a person who's been tortured. So tonight we're thinking about, well, okay, we're talking about psychological torture. How do we terrify people psychologically? Well, I'm not interested tonight in being gruesome and disturbing you, but if we're going to talk about this, I'm going to tell you some things. So think about being threatened with rape, being told you're going to be raped. Think about being told that the gun that's in the room is going to be used to kill you. Think about having that gun put to your head. Think about hearing screams next door and being told those are your guys, those are your friends. They're the people who got you in this trouble. And what we're doing to them will stop as soon as you do something, as soon as you talk. Think about being shown a picture of dead bodies, and maybe even a picture of a person you know, and being told, we did this because of you. Now, none of those things I just said involve touching a person physically, right? None of that involves physical touch, pain, or actual damage to the body. But imagine, if you will, the terror, and remember I just told you terror is physical as well as psychological. Imagine the terror that any of those actions would evoke in you. And the word that I often think of is anticipation. It's sometimes what psychological torture amounts to is a profound period of anticipation of what's yet to come. And I can't tell you how many patients have said to me, that is so much worse than when I was getting beaten, or it's so much worse than when they were shocking me with electrodes or whatever. So to understand people who've been traumatized and tortured, you need to understand terror as a physiological reaction. And by the way, it leads to something that is often diagnosed in folks who've been tortured called post-traumatic stress disorder. I'm not going to get into a big diagnostic conversation, but terror, the kind of substrate of terror that doctors have learned to look for is called PTSD. And we see it in a lot of people who've been through Guantanamo and places like that. The other component that I mentioned that is key to understanding the internal experience of being tortured is helplessness. And helplessness, again, we could walk around this room and every person could give a definition of helplessness and we'd probably all be pretty much within agreement. What I mean when I talk about helplessness and what I've seen in individuals held in Guantanamo and elsewhere is a sense of the absolute inescapability of what is happening to them. And again, this is a psychological experience of believing that nothing you do will matter. You cannot get out of it. And there's a guy who studied this, who studied it in dogs and other he actually studied rats too, who called it learned helplessness. And learned helplessness was if we've used these dogs long enough, they actually stop trying to get out of the shock box, or they stop trying to have bright lights. They just stop, they just lay down. And disturbingly, there have been people who have found ways to operationalize that same idea in humans, which is if we create in a person enough of a feeling that they cannot get out, there's no escaping, and that nothing they do will stop this, we may be able to also create that feeling of absolute total passivity and dependence. And in fact, people engineered this in places run by our government and our allies, and they engineered it off of a program called a SEER program that I'm sure, again, many of you know about. I'm actually not going to go into SEER now. Because what I really want to do tonight is just get a couple ideas in your head. Terror and helplessness, the internal experience of torture. Let me use a couple more examples for helplessness. Think about the idea of being nude in front of people. Think about the idea of being nude and physically displayed in some way. Think about the idea of other kinds of sexual exposure of you or someone enacting something sexual in front of you, or showing you sexually explicit things that are disturbing and certainly unusual for you to see, but particularly for your culture, have profound meanings about sin and about shame. Think about someone taking your religious symbolism or imagery or meanings and mocking them or displaying them in a degrading way. Think about someone holding you in a cell indefinitely with no process of escape and no process legally of ever being able to get out. Again, nothing I just told you had to do with the physical body, right? It was all things you saw. Well, being nude, of course, is your body, but none of this was physical harm, pain. These are all psychological techniques designed to create an experience of helplessness. And I can tell you, I've had many people tell me how fundamentally those actions changed their own psyche and their own ability to cope. So in my mind, terror, PTSD, right? And for me, helplessness, when you see this in individuals who've been tortured, usually kind of manifests itself in depression. You see a lot of depression after someone has been tortured and indefinitely detained. You see a lot of despair. So let me tell you a little bit about interpersonal ideas, and then I want to try to end on a note of hope. Because what I'm talking about now is what happens in us when these things are done to us, right? But almost more profoundly for me as a psychologist over these years of learning about this stuff happening in Guantanamo has been to learn about and to experience what those techniques do to people interpersonally, because it has been absolutely shocking to me what torture yields in terms of people's ability to cope with another individual. So to me, the interpersonal consequences of psychological torture, there's really two I'm going to talk about tonight. And again, I'll be brief, but I hope they kind of stick with you. The first is something I have called and named when I talk to people the culture of interrogation. And the culture of interrogation is when I teach lawyers about what they're going to find when they walk in the room with their Gitmo detainees. I say the first thing that you have to understand is that there is a cloak or a veil or a something covering you that we're going to call the culture of interrogation. And what that means is that everything happening between you and this man is shaped by and influenced by the fact that he has been multiply and chronically interrogated. At times probably in a threatening and violent way, and in many, many cases probably not. The interrogations are not all reaching these levels of maltreatment and abuse and torture. Some of them are absolutely standard. However, they are relentless and multiple. So when you're sitting with a young man or older person, doesn't matter, in Guantanamo, you need to understand that interpersonally they are always experiencing you as an American who reminds them of and therefore evokes the feelings of an interrogation. And those feelings are extremely uncomfortable. And what I've learned in my work is that I can be the nicest, friendliest, warmest little American lady I want to be, and talk all about my nice CV that shows that I work with people from all around the world who've been harmed, and that I'm committed to human rights, and it doesn't matter, because any psychological tactic that I use that's designed to build rapport, right? And I don't know if we have any therapists or social workers in the room, or even lawyers, but rapport building is kind of a big part of what you learn, right? If you're going to work with someone and they're going to tell you deep, profound things that you need to know, they need to feel comfortable with you. Well, guess what? You know who else takes that class in rapport building? Interrogators. So any illusion you have that your good-hearted attempts at working with somebody who's been in Guantanamo are going to be met with, relief, there's finally a good person here, are going to fail. Because you have to understand the culture of interrogation in which that person has been made to feel for probably years like an object who is there to give information. And he has felt manipulated and never viewed probably as a human being. So now we're in the interpersonal realm, right? So if you're sitting with a person who's been psychologically manipulated and tortured and abused, you're going to face that. The second concept that I also kind of coined a phrase for that I think I'm the only person who uses, but I like it. Someday I'll get a trademark on them, I guess, but is what I call the phobia of hope. And the phobia of hope is another thing that happens interpersonally with people who've been psychologically tortured. And what I mean by that is an absolutely rigid and immovable reaction that comes when you try to evoke a sense of the future and a sense of hope in an individual who's had these things happen. Because what happens is you try to evoke hope. Let's think about the future. Let's think where we could go. Let's think how this could turn out okay for you. And there has been so much pain and so much manipulation and so much bad faith efforts coming their way that they are actually phobic of thinking about the future in a hopeful way. Now, why is that interpersonal, right? Doesn't that sound sort of psychological? It's interpersonal because what I've come to learn from Gitmo is that hope is something you don't really do alone. Hope is very much an interpersonal process, I've come to believe. And what Gitmo does By the way, I'm talking extremely broadly right now, and there are things that used to go on in Guantanamo that I actually don't think are going on. I want to make sure I'm clear on that. But what harsh interrogations, what abuse, what maltreatment, what psychological torture did and do to people is they rupture that line that can come between people, like a lifeline, and help them feel hope together. And that's a really, really sad thing to feel in a room with a person. And I felt it a lot with several people. And it almost feels, in these interpersonal examples, I talked about the interpsychic, right? Terror and hopelessness and helplessness. In the interpersonal, I'm talking about this culture of interrogation and this phobia of hope. It can almost feel, when you're trying to pull someone out of that you're abusing them or you're manipulating them. It's a very powerful dynamic in the room. And it's been incredibly daunting to me and incredibly humbling to me as a person who's prided myself over 12 years on being able to work with abused people and kind of connect with them and help them feel safe. Was that in that place, it was very hard to ever make anyone feel safe or make them feel that I was not out to harm them. So I want to end on with the idea of hope, because I feel a little grim in my remarks, and yet I will tell you that I have found and felt and engaged in human interaction with these folks from there, as well as the folks from our clinic before, but again, the focus tonight is Guantanamo. And I felt human connection in a way that has been profound, and I've watched people who had no business trusting me begin to trust me. And I've watched people who had no business laughing and thinking about their future start to do that. And my take on that is that ultimately, if you can get in there and actually make someone feel that you see them as a human again, you can rebuild. You really can. Rebuilding is possible. But in my clinical opinion, and in my personal opinion, and here's Pardis, that rebuilding and that beginning again of being able to feel hope really only happens by other people, happening through other people. It can't really happen in a vacuum. So I have, as despairing as one can get about what we have done, remember that there are still ways that we can rebuild and ways that people carry with them a tremendous resilience and a desire to connect to other people that I've seen in places that I really didn't think I was going to see. So I'm going to end there, hoping that I haven't gone all over the map too much, and hoping that as a psychologist I've shared with you my experience of how our psyche and our ability to be with others is affected very profoundly by these techniques we've used over the years in the war on terror, and how we've got to stop them. Thanks.
That the people that are hurt the most are the torturers, and the society and government that does the torturing. We are the ones who are most harmed by this practice. It's our democracy and our liberty and our sense of the rule of law which is eroded. I would argue that our society is much more fragile than we like to admit. I was at the U.S. Embassy in Côte d'Ivoire, Ivory Coast, and I'm sure most of you don't know much about the history of that country, but it was one of the most stable, richest, prosperous countries in West Africa, with the highest standard of living of anywhere in Africa. And I saw the fragility of that society, and I told them 2 years before this latest civil war, I said, you're going to have a civil war in this country. Your society is going to fragment to pieces. And everybody said, absolutely not. It can't happen here. And the cohesion that keeps us together as a country, the cracks are visible all over the place. And a lot of it is because we compromise on our principles. We compromise our democracy. We compromise our liberty. We compromise the rule of law. And we say, okay, we're just going to torture now just this once because, we were attacked on 9/11 and and we're just going to do it now because we're in an emergency, but it's not going to happen again. But every time we make those compromises, we put another crack in this great country of ours, and it'll hold together. It's kind of like a house that's falling apart from dry rot underneath. I mean, the house is all together, and you're sitting in the house, and the next thing you know, the floor falls in, and you find yourself, on another floor. And none of it is very visible in the beginning, but that's why you hire building inspectors to come and find